Hey, in this interview with Dr. Ryan Mullins, we talk about why systematic theologians, many of them, think that God doesn't feel emotions, that he is completely unresponsive to us in any core way, and then what the biblical authors might have to say about that. So, this is going to be a spicy one, so buckle up. If you like what we're doing, you can hit the like and subscribe or like and subscribe here. It helps the algorithms. And if you really like what we're doing, you can go to hebraicthought.org/give and you can become a recurring donor or a good old-fashioned one-time giver. And that helps us produce these podcasts and the content on this website. What is a common hurdle you run into when you're trying to explain how systematic theologians view God? We'll stick to the doctrine of God, but we can veer anywhere here. But what's kind of like a common misunderstanding or a hurdle or a conceptual gap that you have to bridge in order to kind of get them on the page with most of what's going on in systematic theology?
Yeah, so systematic theologians, they tell themselves this very false narrative about the history of ideas. And so the false narrative goes like this. There's this one doctrine of God that everyone and their mother has always believed throughout all of history until you get to the 20th century. And depending on how aware they are of what goes on in the 20th century, there's different breaking points of when they'll go, this is when everything went really bad. So for some people, it'll be like when the process theists, when they came around and and you're like, ooh, okay, that was terrible, And then some of the process theology, like when you read it, it is bad writing. So you're like, okay, that's fair, For others, it'll be like when those dirty open theists came around in the 1990s and things like that. But I've been able to trace out the history of ideas a lot more and go, there's breaking points way before this, going back incredibly early, to such an extent that I want to say there is no such thing as the traditional doctrine of God. I think there are a lot of different models of God throughout a history across the world's religions and within Christianity. And some of the results are kind of surprising. So you see open theism, for example, being debated in the 1400s, and it's declared by one of these popes, you're not allowed to talk about it anymore. And that was in the 1400s. So clearly, no one got the memo because we're still talking about it today. But this is like one of these moments where you're just like, I thought there was this traditional doctrine of God that no one broke from until, the dirty 20th century. So that's usually one of the biggest hurdles. And then trying to get them to look at scripture, you can't do that because they're so trapped in this mindset of there's this traditional doctrine of God, and I can bring up a Bible passage in any one I want, and they won't really consider it because they're like, well, no, we know what the traditional doctrine of God says.
Yeah. And when you say doctrine of God, you're largely the question we're asking is, what is God? Like specifically, yes. What kind of a thing is he? And not supposing that God is a creature or part of creation even, but just to speculate. So like where can you go with that question when people say, what kind of a thing is God? I mean, we can set aside for the question whether that's even an appropriate question to ask about God and say, okay, if it were an appropriate question, what are your options as far as the kinds of ways you can answer that question?
Yeah, so what I try to do in my own work is break down what I call the concept of God that I see this massive agreement on across the spectrum, and then different conceptions or models of God. So the concept of God is that of a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. Like that's it. So whatever God is, God's perfect. That doesn't really tell you a lot.
Right.
And then God's the foundation of reality. And you're like, well, what's that? And I'm like, right. Concepts are thin, like justice, giving people what they deserve. You're like, cool. What's that look like? You're like, well, let me tell you, you got to unpack it. So that's what a model of God's going to do. It's going to say, here's what I think perfection consists in. Like, here are the kind of attributes that a perfect being would have. Like necessary existence, eternal, all powerful, all knowing, all good, these kind of things. And then there's a bunch of stuff people disagree on, but a lot of people like those omnis. And then when it comes to how God's the foundation of reality, again, you're going to have a lot of disagreements. Some people are going to say God creates out of nothing. Ooh, okay, cool. Others, no. He creates out of pre-existent material stuff. And like, I don't know what that means. Whatever. Others like he creates out of feeling. And I'm like, this is the process view. There's these feelings that pop in and out of existence, these experiences that pop in and out of existence, and God like woos them somehow because you can woo an unattached experience. I don't know what that means, but that's just the view. And then there's others who will say, no. God eternally creates. God's always creating a universe of some sorts. Or others will say it just emanates from God. God's not even thinking about it. It's just kind of like it's just there, just like flowing from him, like it's just unintentional fart from God or something, you know, like that's what the universe is. So those are ways
And
to
then
be
the
the
next
yeah.
theological question is it silent and is it deadly?
I mean, well, depending on how you look at the universe, some of it's kind of deadly. So you know, like
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, and all of these are, and I think when I first ran into systematic theology, even when in the history of theology, I think it was one of my early seminary courses. It felt very much to me like reading quantum mechanics.
mm.
They were saying things where I was like you said, whatever that means. I mean, I constantly found myself like thinking, well, but what does that mean? And how would you know if that were the case? So I think in terms of thinking down that line of okay, if God is this, then this is how we would know that we're true. What lines of reasoning can they attach, right?
Yeah, and it helps too when you throw in some untranslated Latin, you know, in the mix. Like these are things that make systematics like really easy to like user friendly.
Right, right.
But yeah, like a big part for me in my own studies, it was like really trying to get my head around what are the different concepts at play here? What are the different doctrines? What do some of these untranslated Latin words mean? And then only after that could I finally start asking the question, how would I know if this is true? Because I couldn't, you know, I couldn't ask that question if I didn't understand what the claims even were. Yeah, and so that's where I am at this point in my life. I feel like I do understand not all of the claims in systematic theology, but a fair number, especially with regards to the doctrine of God. And it really helps me realize how much is a lot of like man-made kind of like development of ideas, how much philosophy is really being shoved into the picture here, and then how much, you know, some of it is just like this is just some mystery mongering, you know, like you're just ignoring whatever problems we have, and then some of it I'm like, oh, okay, I can actually figure out an argument for or against this. Oof. You know, it took me only 20 years to get here. Oh gosh,
Right.
You know, like,
Yeah, I think for a lot of things that you read, like when I used to teach philosophy of religion at a public university, you have to say things like, well, in classical view, I fell into the trap too. Classically, we think of
yeah,
God as he can't have extension, like, and students are always like, what do you mean he can't
yeah.
have
What is
extension? Well, like if he's a thing, nothing can come out, right? Like nothing can point. He can't point at anything, right? With his essence. Um, and I found it for myself too. You start saying these things almost as if they're dogma. This is why it feels like quantum mechanics. So you're just saying things, and there's not really any empirical test you can put on them. But students were going, but I don't. Who cares? Like, why do people care about this? And that became my rubric for thinking about systematic theology across history. Is when they're saying something that sounds weird to me, it's because they cared about that because they lived in a different culture, time, and place than I do, where
Yes.
we don't care about that anymore. So, what would you say are the weirdest things that people have cared about in the past that maybe we don't anymore about?
There's a ton of stuff. So there was this one time period, starting the late Middle Ages with Catholic theology, where John Duns Scotus develops this idea of logical moments in the life of God, because he's got this problem about how can a timeless God have free will? Because in order to perform a free action, you're not doing something and then you do something. You're not doing something and you contemplate your right, what would it be good to do? And then you do it.
Right.
If he's timeless, there's no God not doing anything and then he contemplates it for a while and then he does it. Like you don't have that. Because if God is timeless, God exists as a whole or all at once, a single moment without a before and after. So there's no like time for God to think about stuff and then decide what to do. So Scotus comes up with this really like interesting, it's very creative kind of view of these logical moments where he's like maybe somehow super embedded into God's single timeless moment, there's this like long series of logical moments. They're not temporal, dude. Trust me, I swear they're not temporal. Like they look just.
We should let the listener know that this is a very classic move in
Yes.
philosophical theology. It's like no, not temporal. It's logically prior, and
Yeah,
you're like,
it's
well,
logical.
but doesn't that entail? And okay, anyways, we'll
Yeah,
let that
yeah,
slide.
yeah. And I've got a paper called "Does Divine Providence Entail Temporality?" Maybe
Okay.
it does, but so Scotus is trying to get out of this problem, and then and he comes up with this like whole series of these logical moments in the life of God to give God not time, but to give God like logic to think about stuff, and then decide what to freely do. And that creates this huge ripple effect in a lot of Catholic and Protestant thought that comes later. And so when you get into the Protestant tradition, there's these huge debates that some people listening might have heard of about like infralapsarian versus supralapsarianism, and then this Amyraldian view, and you're just like, try to keep these straight in your head.
I have a chart.
Yeah, exactly, because there's all these ancient charts. Well, not ancient because they're late after the Reformation, but yeah, you have all these charts that get written up because it's impossible to keep it straight. And they're really passionate about this. I mean, I'm talking like people. There's this guy named Moses Amaro in France who's a Calvinist, and he almost loses his job because his ordering of the logical moments looks too much like those dirty Arminians. And
Wow.
you're a good Calvinist, you can't be one of those. And so he's like, oh no, look, these are just concepts in my head. They don't apply to reality. And everyone's like, oh, okay, it's fine. But yeah, they got really passionate about this. Whereas today, only a few handful of theology nerds care about this. This isn't stuff that's hotly. There's not the Southern Baptist Convention's not having we're gonna cull a whole bunch of professors over this right now. At least not right now. I mean, give it to 5 years maybe,
But you could say at this point in history, people actually had concepts of a plan of salvation.
yes.
So, and the concepts were vigorous, and it's because they cared about this logical ordering because it came through this very particular tradition that, well, as people may or may not know, Aristotelian tradition gets in bed with Roman Catholic dogma, and you can't separate. You can't say Aristotle's view of the world, the physics and metaphysics, is fundamentally wrong, without indicting entire wings of Christian theology, including a lot of Protestant Christian theology. So Southern Baptist Convention is at their General Assembly is not having fights about these kinds of things. However, in my church, I'm just going to say in worship songs or things coming out during prayer in the worship praise section, these ideas are constantly repeated, right? So God, you are outside of time. You are not within time, right? And then when people ask me that, as a biblical scholar, I'd go, yeah, I don't know where people get that from. I mean, it sounds great. I don't know where they're getting it from in Scripture, and I don't know, and even more so, I don't know why they want it to be true. Now I can generate some reasons why people throughout time wanted, or history wanted it to be true, or God, you're infinite, and then I have to say well, which kind of infinity? Because Cantor outlines a few, and they're mutually exclusive from each other. So
yeah, and then he has a whole separate catergory for God as well,
right,
like Cantor does.
Right.
So he's all this math stuff, and you're just like, okay, so these sets, and then there's what you can't. What it is, it's really difficult to figure out. And he's like, oh yeah, but none of that applies to God. There's this other category. And you're like, what's for God? And he's like, oh, he's perfect. And I'm like,
yeah, it's just olive.
I already knew he was perfect. Come on, man. You're not, so you wasted my time here.
But the interesting point, and actually I edited a book called The Question of God's Perfections, where we kind of hashed this out amongst Jewish and Christian scholars. And somebody pointed out in that book, they just asked the simple question, is it appropriate to use mathematical analogies to speak of the attributes of God? Now, for a long period in church history, because of Aristotle, and they're like, yeah, absolutely, because God is math, and God is geometry, and he's a perfect sphere, and all this stuff. But as those metaphors change, as the engineering metaphors, right? So perfection in engineering means something after the 20th century that it didn't mean prior to the 19th century. How do you adjudicate all of these? How do you figure out which are appropriate and inappropriate metaphors to think about God?
It's really difficult. So some of the metaphors, on their surface, on their face, I can just kind of go, that doesn't make any sense. And that's how I feel about infinity, of going, well, this is a mathematical concept. Is God a mathematical object? No. Okay. We can move on. But you've got the last 1,000 years. The first 1,000 years of church history, they weren't really big on calling God infinite. Augustine doesn't really like it. Origen has a whole argument against calling God infinite. But I didn't know this at first. But by the time you get to the late Middle Ages and into today, you want to deny God's infinite? What's wrong with you? You're a heretic.
Right.
You're denying the Bible. And I'm like,
right.
Oh, am I? Okay.
Yeah.
You remember that? You remember that one verse, in Hezekiah where it talks about God being infinite? And I'm like, oh gosh, that's right.
Hezekiah 4:4. Yeah.
Yeah. So part of what I had to do was I was curious, so I had to look down the history of this, and that's when I discovered all these different scholars talking about just the changing of what infinity meant. So a lot of Aristotelians would say infinity means something that's incomplete or imperfect. Well, God's perfect, so God can't be infinite. Like, oh, okay. Origen's argument goes like this: to be infinite is to be unknowable. God is all-knowing, so God knows himself. Well, God's not infinite, and I'm like, oh gosh, okay. So you got this kind of view, but what it changes, the metaphor changes to mean something perfect. And Scotus does a really good job at cleaning up a lot of this stuff. So we're talking, much later in history, and the concept changes. And so now I'm like, okay, I think I know what you guys are talking about. And then today, now I'm like, I've lost again. I don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's having to sit down and learn what the history of the metaphors are to see how they've changed and to try to figure out what's the underlying metaphysical claim, if there is one.
Right. Yeah, that is almost entirely lost. And to me, I mean, I haven't studied the history of metaphysics and systematic theology, and so if I read that in John Calvin, I just assume he means it in some kind of medievalist way, church medieval theology, and I guess I've backed off of saying omni or anything, any kind of perfection categories, and I've moved into what I think is a little more true to the language and metaphors of Scripture, which is God is all-knowing, and by that I mean he knows everything that he needs to know in order to do everything he needs to do. He's all-powerful, that he has all the power, he's all-present, and that he needs to be present in the places he needs to be present to do the kinds of things he needs to do. And so I think those are nice, safe, minimalist claims. There's probably something philosophically complicated about them that I'm not thinking of, which is fine. I'm happy to work those out with good sisters and brothers over time. I guess my question is, because you swim in these circles, you may have even been arrested by the awe and this kind of thinking. Is what's the push to make the stronger claim, like that we're gonna map it out entirely? Because there is a whole other wing of theology that says we can't say anything about God. We can only say what God is not. Right?
Yeah, and I reject that view because I'm like, if we're not allowed to say, if we can't say anything true about God or anything positive about God, then that makes revelation impossible. And I'm like, I think God's smart enough to figure out how to reveal just a little bit about himself to us. And so that negates this entire apophatic tradition. But let's set that aside. Yeah, so you've got these different kinds of arguments you look through Scripture and people will say, okay, it says God's almighty. And you're like, sounds like an all-encompassing claim. Isn't that just omnipotence, like all power, And some people will try to say, well, maybe there's some differences here, there's some nuances there, and I'm not super convinced by those. When it comes to all-knowing, there's a lot of stuff it seems God knows about the universe. And it seems like these pretty like grand superlatives. So you might go, well, why not just say all-knowing? Like, what would be the problem with that? And so here's one kind of argument you might have for saying, like, you really do need to go with the all-knowing and the all-powerful and the all these omnis. So I go back to that concept of God. God's supposed to be the ultimate foundation of reality. When I'm trying to give an ultimate explanation for reality, that ultimate explanation, it shouldn't have any like weird, bizarre, arbitrary stuff attached to it. It shouldn't just have like an arbitrary stopping point. It's supposed to be a natural stopping point. And if you say like, well, God knows most things, but not all things, you have a natural like kind of like set up and go like, wait, why?
Yeah, why the difference?
Yeah, what's like? Why not? Like, why does he not know? Why is he like really powerful but not all powerful? Why is So why are there these limits? Because and that question should not arise if it's an ultimate explanation. And so that's why I think you're going to see a lot of people when they're engaged in this method called perfect being theology. When someone like Brian Leftow, he's like, well, my intuitions about perfection aren't great, so let me look at the Bible. There's a bunch of superlatives about God being like really, really powerful and like really wise and stuff. Why not just go all powerful, all knowing? Like, because otherwise I'm going to have these kind of arbitrary stuff in my explanation of reality.
Yeah. That makes sense, and that brings us to the natural point that I wanted to talk about is, well, what role does Scripture play in this? Because all knowing, I can say things like, well, Jesus, who's part of the Godhead, doesn't presently know when he's going to return. God doesn't know what it's like to be a bat or to be a sinner, so there's all kinds of very low hanging fruit, no pun intended,
right?
Things that we could say are things that God doesn't know and maybe chooses not to know. We don't necessarily we don't know why. But there, I'm just making a bald appeal that Scripture has some authority to shape our concept of who God is.
I mean, look, all systematic theologians, they say Scripture is like the ultimate authority in our theological thinking.
They
They
do.
say it. They say it. Uh,
Indeed, they do say that.
yeah.
Yes.
Do they consistently or meaningfully follow through with that? It depends what day of the week you ask me. Today you're getting Snarky Ryan, and Snarky Ryan says no, like not even close. Like, so when you look at a lot of these passages, they bother some theologians, like they bother me. But a lot of others, they're like, well, it's just anthropomorphism. That's just metaphor. And they just have these like network of slogans they use to prevent any sort of difficult thinking on their part.
Which, just to clarify, by anthropomorphism, you just mean we're attributing attributes to God that we understand, but we don't actually mean that God is those things.
Yeah. So like, like God's like, is my arm too short to save you? And you're like, well, does God actually have an arm? And you're like, that's not. It was a well-known idiom at the time that everyone knew what this phrase meant. And you're like, oh, right. Okay, cool.
Which is actually an idiom about Pharaoh, the Ramesside pharaohs. So
yeah, and so like that. So that's why I'm like, okay, I need some biblical studies people to help me out here. Like, okay, like, and so, but that's kind of what you'll see a lot of systematic theologians do is they'll look at these passages and go, well, we know it doesn't mean God has an arm, and you don't even have to ask, well, what does it mean? Because, well, I just know it doesn't mean that, and I can go back to doing whatever I wanted to be doing, because that slogan just like cuts off that pathway of whatever going down that rabbit hole of what does it mean. Don't even have to figure that out. The fathers probably figured that out. Some medievalists probably figured it out. I don't have to figure it out. Like, okay, cool. So for me, though, I do want to know what those things mean, and it's forced me to rethink a lot of issues. So when I think about God's power, I don't just say like God could do all things because I don't know exactly what that is, because I don't know what all the things are. You know, I haven't figured that out yet. I'm young enough, maybe I will before I die. I don't know. But what I want to say is, what it means to be omnipotent is to have the most power-granting set of abilities and no liabilities or weaknesses. And so, like certain kinds of powers or abilities are things like the ability to know stuff, the ability to do things. But there are weaknesses. There are weaknesses like I have the ability to be irrational. Is that a power or is that a weakness? You're probably thinking like it's probably kind of a weakness, you know. Like at least I'd hope you think it is. I've got the ability to do really horrible, awful, nasty, sinful things, and you're like, well, that kind of sucks. Like that's not a good thing about me. That's not a power that I have. It's actually a weakness. So I'm going to okay, let's exclude those from God. And now I can start making sense of various biblical passages. When I look at like God can't do this or that, you see these kind of statements in Scripture, like God's not going to lie, God's not going to deceive you in these kind of certain ways. I'm like, well, yeah, because that would be a weakness. Okay. Now powers can be, I can like do stuff with my powers or I can refrain from doing things with my powers. I can bench press 200 pounds. I'm not going to because I did it at the gym earlier today. And so I'm really tired. So I'm not going to like prove to you I can do that, but like, dude, trust me, like I can totally bench press. Yeah. Now I could exercise these powers or not exercise them. I could use them or not use them. In the incarnation, you could say like, yeah, God's just not using a range of his powers for a while. He's not using a range of his cognitive powers. So he's got the power to know all sorts of stuff, but he's just not using it right now. Okay, cool. No big deal. Does God know what it's like to be a sinner? Well, he can empathize with you. He knows what it's like for you to sin. Mm-hmm. But does he know what it's like for him himself to sin? No, because that would be a weakness for him to sin and to know like that firsthand kind of way, what it's like to sin. Does God know what it's like to be a bat? Some people say, yeah. If there is something that it's like to be a bat, then God will know that. But will God know he is a bat? No.
Okay. Well, so why would I threw that out because this is a famous paper in philosophy.
Yeah.
To prove something non-physical in consciousness. But again, why would somebody want God to know what it's like to be a bat? Because they want God to know every last thing, because then that secures a chain of events that secures everything in God, right?
This is one of the arguments. There's other arguments though for this. Why God would have this, what people will sometimes call phenomenal knowledge or experiential knowledge. So what it's like to eat a cheeseburger. I can describe to you what it's like to go to a heavy metal show, and I can give you very like detailed descriptions of what it's like to be at a metal show and like what the mosh pit's like and all this or that. And then it's another thing to actually go to the metal show and experience those things. It's a different kind of knowledge. And so one argument is, well, if God's really all-knowing, or God really does have like maximal power to know all things, then God's going to have the ability or the power to know that kind of stuff too. And you're like, okay, cool, all right. But here's another argument though that I think is really interesting and important. One argument is, well, if God's supposed to be the perfect judge, and you see this in Scripture, God's going to Job's constantly like, God, come down and judge me. And you're like, ooh, okay. He wants God to judge him. I don't feel that brave.
No, I do not.
Yeah.
Not a day of the week where I'm going to say that to God.
But God's supposed to be this perfect judge. Now, if God doesn't really understand your situation, if God doesn't really understand what it's like to be you in your day-to-day life and what you're really going through, can God really be a perfect judge? Maybe God needs to have that kind of knowledge that can only be gained through empathy or compassion or whatever, how you ever want to cut it. Maybe that's what God needs to really be a perfect judge.
Yeah, I think that last move you just made, where you employed Scripture, a narrative in Scripture, to make a philosophical point, right, is that we have these, it's not just a data point, but that there was a real expectation that God could be a fair judge in that moment. And so... And I want to come back to that, like, how do we do that? And obviously, as the Center for Hebraic Thought, we've got lots of ideas on that front. But I guess I want to go to the other side. If people are, what I see in systematic theology sometimes is cherry-picking sentences out of Scripture in order to support the point, and I can give some examples here. What is the other thing then that they're relying upon? What does have the most authority in their thinking and driving their...
So there's this kind of dogma in systematic theology. It's usually taken to be like an axiom, which is you've got Scripture on the one hand, and then you have philosophy on the other hand. And I'll find all these different systematic theologians who will say we have to use philosophy to help us create our system within which we can place all these different biblical ideas. And so philosophy sometimes it's like the grid through which we put Scripture in. They don't often want to say that last sentence because it makes it sound like I'm eisegeting instead of exegeting, like I'm forcing Scripture to conform to my views instead of me being conformed to Scripture. So no one wants to put it in the exact way I do. So instead they'll say framework instead of grid, because there's a big difference there. Yeah, right. Massive difference. And so here's an example of this. So Louis Berkhoff. He's like, okay, let's look at the biblical account of God being eternal. And he's like, well, when you look at all these passages in Scripture and you put them all together, it's pretty clear that eternity in the Bible just means like unending time. So God undergoes succession. He does one thing and then another. But Berkhoff's like, but we know on the basis of real philosophy that that's false. So clearly that's not what Scripture intends to say. It does say it, but it doesn't intend to say it because we know from true philosophy that God is timeless. This is a great way of seeing how, like, philosophy, whichever philosophical system you want, it does create this grid from which you place biblical passages into.
Yeah, and so what we advocate here, Center for Hebraic Thought, is that let the biblical authors be their own philosophers, have their own philosophical systems, and let them build the grid through which, it's kind of like when I assign a book to be reported by undergrads, I always say, hey, don't skip the preface. Because the preface is where the author tells you what they think they're going to do in this book. Because then you might unfairly judge them and say, "Oh, this book they should have addressed it." But they said in the preface, "I'm not going to address." N.T. Wright famously says in his, I think it's Jesus and the Victory of God, "I'm not going to deal with John's gospel. It's just too wild." Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that can't be one of your complaints about the book. And in the same way, I think if you let the biblical authors construct a sense of time and then eternity, then you can kind of understand the kinds of things they think about eternity. And for me, there's another move you have to make where you have to say, like, and maybe they're right, right? Because you can do all of that and just say, Yeah, but they were these Iron Age, farmers that really didn't understand reality until Plato came along. But maybe theirs is possibly a better metaphysical view of time. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, and that last bit is what I don't often see because so like I mean this goes very far back. So there's this prolegomena, this like difficult question that gets asked a whole lot throughout the Christian tradition. You see this in Saint Augustine in the 400s. You see it in people in the East like John Scythopolis, and then later on in the Middle Ages like from Peter Lombard. Here's the question: God consistently describes eternity in temporal terms instead of timeless terms. Why did he do that? Like, why did he do that? And eventually you get these really creative answers. And this is the answer. This is not me being cheeky. This actually is the answer. You are too stupid to understand what God is like. You are too childish to understand the deep truths of God. So God has to present himself to you not as he is, but as you want to see him. So everybody wants to see him as like being temporal. Everyone wants to see him as like suffering and like having compassion and mercy. But really, God's not like that. But you're just too dumb to understand. So God has to condescend when he talks to you.
Is this not some wild version of Plato's cave?
You could say it's like that. I haven't been able to trace down the full history of like all these kinds of moves because you see it in some other thinkers prior to Augustine. But this is just the way it develops is like there's really the way God is, and then God has to speak down to us in this kind of baby talk sort of way.
It's kind of like a token perspective of you get to see the face, and I could easily pull up passages, right? Like you can't look at my face, let me pass by you, right? Like there's this, although some people apparently do see the face of God in Scripture as well, and it's unclear why some do and some don't, in what periods. But that idea that God is actually one way and presents himself another way, you said it in such a way that there seemed to be an implicit problem with that. But what is actually explicitly wrong with that?
Here's what I think is wrong with it.
I mean, I agree with you.
Yeah, because the words I'm saying are the exact words that like Stephen Charnock or John Calvin or Anselm will say, but they don't say it with the tone that I had it, because the tone I have it is clearly like this is something's here's what I think something's wrong. So here's this argument I have. I've actually published on this. So the claim is you look at all these passages where God's like, I've got all this empathy, I have all this compassion, and you're like, okay, cool. Why is God saying that? And well, he's saying that not because he actually has compassion or empathy, because God actually cannot have any empathy at all. It's impossible for God to empathize with you. But he says he has empathy so that you will draw closer to him. And I'm like, okay, psychologists have a really clear profile for what this kind of person is like. Certain people who have very low levels of empathy, but say they have lots of empathy in order to get you to be in a relationship with them. And these are called psychopaths. And so I'm like, right there on the surface, it feels wrong to say, well, you just gave God the emotional profile of a psychopath. Like that, this is bad. But it turns out God's actually better at being a psychopath than human psychopaths are, because human psychopaths at least have some level of empathy, whereas this view on God is like God can't have any empathy at all. And so like, so
necessarily like, zero, yeah,
yeah. So he's like the maximal psychopath, and you're like, this sounds really bad, yeah. And so I think it gives us a weird view of God.
And just to complete the thought, for some people are going, wait, theologians have thought, and many of them do still think for a long time, that God has zero empathy. He has no passion. He cannot grieve. He cannot be sad. He cannot be happy. He can't rejoice. And just to complete the thought, why do they think this?
Well, so it goes back.
I think this is very shocking to most normal Christians who just read the Bible. Yeah.
Yeah. So like when I did all my stuff on like God and time, like I've written 2 books on that. Most people are like, God's probably timeless. I don't know what that means, but it's probably true. And I'm like, okay. And then when I come to, okay, well, what about God having like not getting sad or anything like that? They're like, didn't people in the past read the Bible? And I'm like, they did, but so yeah, this is like a really big difference in people's kind of gut reactions to these different projects. So this issue of impassibility, here's how strong the claim is. So the claim is it's impossible for God to suffer. And you're going to go, well, why can God not suffer? And they're like, well, because it's impossible for God to be moved or influenced by anything outside of himself. His beliefs cannot be influenced by you. His actions, his emotions cannot be influenced by you. And you're still going to go, why? Because why would that be the case? Here's one of the arguments for that. God is perfectly happy. God is perfectly happy because God is the greatest good. And to be perfectly happy is to be aligned with the greatest good. Well, if you are the greatest good, you're just going to be perfectly happy. It would be irrational for God to act on the basis of anything other than the greatest good. So God's actions cannot be based on you or I because we're not the greatest good. They can only be based on God then. God's emotional life can only be based on, justified by the greatest good. So if God got sad because of, some major war or a genocide or something, it would be irrational for God to be sad about that, because he'd be judging his emotions on the basis of something less than the greatest good. That's the reason for why God can't be this way, according to lots of people in the Christian tradition.
And that secures a perfect God in this narrowly constrained view of perfection.
Yes, they're on their account of perfection, yes.
So it's kind of like, well, if we have to give up a God who cares and it cares in a way that he reacts in any way to his creation, then that's the limb we're going to have to amputate in order to maintain the perfect God.
Yes, and you'll see this really explicitly. So there's some different Protestant theologians in the 1700s who are super explicit. They're like, yeah, God doesn't have empathy, and it's a good thing, because if he did have empathy, he wouldn't be perfect. He wouldn't be impassible. And so you're like, ooh, yeah. So there's quite explicit statements on this.
And I can imagine, there could be some theologians listening saying, "Oh no, I've actually got a way around that. Like there's this philosophy of X or Y or Z, and if you take that into consideration, then you could still have your cake and eat it too." But we're actually questioning the whole project, like why you would want to make an exception, and why do you have to do all this kind of juggling?
Yeah, because when there was a point you made in your book on Hebraic philosophy about the moral philosophy of the Hebrew Bible, and you said empathy and compassion were these really foundational concepts in the moral philosophy of the Hebrew Bible. And I thought that was really interesting because when you go through, the Old Testament, you do see God being described as rich in mercy, rich in compassion, rich in empathy. Right. And it's very consistent. And there's never a passage where you see it say, no, he doesn't actually have that. And I'm like, okay. So they think that part of what it means to be good, morally good, is to have empathy. And then they carry that over to well, God's morally good, so God's got empathy.
Right.
It's a really straightforward perfect being argument. There's this thing, empathy. It's better to have empathy than not. God's perfect, so he's going to have all the things that are better to have than not, so he's going to have empathy. And you're like, okay, so it's the same kind of argument style that you're going to see people who disagree in terms of the method to how to get the attributes. So I'm like, okay, so the argument seems to very, very much the same way, but why are all these theologians dismissing that kind of argument, that argumentation style, when it comes to, well, you find it in the Bible? Anselm didn't do it, but the same reasoning that Anselm would use is used in the Bible. Why is it bad when the Bible does it? It's good when Anselm does it. And I don't have an answer to that. No one will give me the answer, because they look at me like I'm an idiot, because well, you're treating the Bible like it's philosophy. And I'm like, yeah. Watch me. I'll do it all day long. Why not?
Yeah, and in that book, I try to make a on the ground argument that if aliens came to the Earth and looked at all these different intellectual systems throughout history, I don't think they treat the biblical literature radically different than Socrates and the great Greeks, or the Chinese philosophy, or some versions of African philosophy, depending on what you mean by African. Yeah, and I think that gets to the heart of the matter, which is, and I'll give one example. I won't name any names here, but you can.
If I feel naming and shaming.
Well, I mean, I think there's systematic theology projects I think Wayne Grudem's, because it's probably the most read systematic theology in modern history, maybe in history writ large, where he does a lot of what we call proof texting. He clarifies an idea, and then he gives a lot of passages. And when I work those passages as a biblical scholar, I'm many times going I don't think that passage is doing what you think it's doing. I have to do the Enigma Montoya on Wayne. And I don't think Wayne is being deceitful. Anybody who knows Wayne, like he's not trying to deceive anybody, or he's not trying to build a Rube Goldberg machine. He really believes he's clarifying what the tradition and Scripture teaches. But I was talking to a systematic theologian once who worked on omnipresence, and I said, "Oh, that's interesting. I've written on omnipresence, and I think it's kind of a problematic concept for lots of reasons from within Scripture." Um, and I said, "Well, what's your kind of go-to argument from Scripture?" And he said, "Oh, Psalm 139, where can I flee from the presence of the Lord? Everywhere I go, I will be there." Right, to paraphrase, right?
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to watch this guy who had been philosophically trained turn off his philosophical brain and quote that scripture as if it supported. And I was like, can you like turn your philosophical brain back on for 1 second? Assume that the biblical authors have a philosophical bone in their body. That in no way entails logically that God is everywhere present. It basically means God is a stalker. And the very point of the sentence, like if I said the same things to my wife, it doesn't mean that I'm omnipresent.
Right.
It means that I'm going to be where the goal is to show that I'm going to be present with her. It also doesn't logically negate omnipresence either,
No.
right?
No.
Because it's trying to do something else. And
Yes.
so those are the kinds of moves that I might even agree with in principle, the conclusion that they come to. But it's the method by which they're coming that makes me worried. So I wonder, do you see this? I mean, I'm thinking of Wayne, which he wrote a very popular level systematic theology. But do you think this is endemic in the program, or is it necessary, or am I just like getting too triggered by the few examples that I've seen?
I mean, you might just be getting triggered because
Yeah,
there's loads of cases of this. For me, there was always this big disconnect because when I did my undergraduate training, I didn't really have a lot of training in systematics. I had a lot of training in biblical studies and biblical theology. And this kind of idea of going, you have to really look at what the passage means before you start jumping to do the dogma. I had that going on. And then I also had but I really like St. Augustine because he's so cool. So I've got these conflicting kind of ideas in my own upbringing, like my own intellectual like education. And one of the things that helped me go back to Scripture is when I started reading lots of different kinds of theologians and philosophers and seeing how much disagreement there really is over a lot of these different doctrinal points about the nature of God, about salvation, about you name it. And one of the things that really forced me to do is like, okay, I'm just like, I sit down, I read I read all of Wayne Grudem, and then I read, any other systematic theologian, and then I come back to the biblical text, and I'm like, oh man, I'm seeing some stuff I didn't see before. Or there's other stuff going on beneath the surface I wasn't paying attention to because I was only thinking in terms of, well, this is the answer that everyone and their mother always gave. I know that. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I don't because I didn't actually read the history part, didn't do that part of the homework, but I know that, right? So seeing lots of different kinds of disagreements in different debates forced me to go back and look at the text again and go, okay,
interesting,
right, there's more going on here. So it kind of forced me to take off the blinders that I had.
Yeah, Josh Blander is probably clapping right now. You have to go, read more systematic theology. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the same way that when I studied analytic philosophy, and which forced me to read a lot of different types of philosophy. Strangely enough, I realized, philosophy is way wider than I originally thought it was. I thought it was one thing, and then the more I read, I was like, it's a lot of things, and everybody's got their own definition.
Which is why, so when you, like, this was years ago, before you had written your Hebraic philosophy book, like when you first told me about it, I was like, that sounds kind of nuts. I'll allow it. Why not? But I just thought it sounded kind of nuts. And then
probably wasn't the best representative of my own work as well. I tend not to be.
It happens sometimes, but I just remember thinking about it later on, like writing, I think it was probably like that day you told me it was like on the train back home, and just kind of thought, well, it doesn't look like Peter Van Inwagen's Introduction to Metaphysics, but thankfully most things are not like that. As much as I love that book, not everything should look like that. And then I started thinking about, like, remember when I had that like Paul Ricoeur phase, like where I really loved reading him, and I tried to read Sartre, that didn't go very well, but I was like, these are different philosophical traditions, and some of the stuff I see in Scripture doesn't look too far away from that. Poetry, if I'm really, I'm interested in Eastern philosophy and a lot of these different schools of thought, I can't study that without reading some poetry. Okay. And so I started just thinking, lining up all these examples and going, if I'm going to count that as philosophy, then I'm going to have to count this one book of the Bible as philosophy. I'm going to have to count this other one and this other one. And then eventually I got to the point I'm like, what would I exclude in the
Right.
Old Testament? I don't know. Really don't know.
Yeah. Becomes difficult. And
Yeah.
in
So it
that
was an
book,
example of where you presented a different idea that was contrary to my own, and it forced me to think about it. And I was able to come back to it anew and go, are my blinders on or off here right now?
success. All right.
Yeah.
Well, one by one, as the old evangelism platform used to say. Well, and I think that is what and I say in the book, 15, 20 years ago when I was saying, hey, maybe we ought to be paying attention to the biblical narrative a little bit more. There was very much a like, what are you talking about? No, that's not the game we're playing. I do feel like now things have changed. People are just a lot more open, and I don't know why, like sociologically or
I don't know.
culturally, academics why, but people are just a little bit more open to the idea. And it might be just the kind of that general valuing of other cultures that has just gotten typically better and better. Who knows what's going on now? Speaking of empathy and those kinds of things.
Sure.
But that, like, oh, we have things to learn from other cultures. Oh, well, the biblical authors lived in another culture, so maybe we can put them alongside. And there's no reason. I mean, I have an op-ed written that I've never launched off anywhere. Well, I tried to send it to the New York Times, but they quit doing their philosophy op-eds.
Right.
Basically, just saying by any critical measurement, the biblical, the Southwest Asian philosophy should be taught in every public philosophy program. If you're going to teach Eastern and Southern Asian philosophy, it should be taught as well as part of the world philosophy curriculum. So I always say, and I think we are also kind of discussing this in light of that you wrote a response to my book that's going to be part of a symposium for Philosophia Christi. I can never say it right.
Christine.
Philosophia Christi,
Yeah.
which is the journal for the Evangelical Philosophical Society. So that's coming out, I think, in a couple weeks, with a few philosophers that responded to it very generously. And all of my one goal is to get people to like not assume that the biblical authors are dumb, that they don't have any sophisticated thoughts, and that they can use these various forms of literature to actually make very sophisticated arguments about the nature of reality, the nature of God, and everything connected in between. And you seem to be one of those people that picked up on it. Um, I'm wondering, like, what's your next? So this is kind of shifting a little bit here, but what's your next project? And then I'm very interested. How are you using Scripture in your work, or do you do like I do often and just kind of say, well, all my colleagues who study this more closely
I mean,
say
it's
this is what's
always
going
nice.
on.
Yeah, it's always
Yeah,
nice to do that, to offload like the work, to be like, well, these other people are already doing it better than I can, so I'm
yeah,
just going
yeah,
to do this narrow
absolutely.
thing. Yeah, so I've got a couple different projects. One's like a high level academic, and then one's like more popular. I'll mention the high level academic one first. So it's going to be a debate between me and this philosopher from at the University of Manchester named Muhammad Saleh Zapor. So we had been asked to do a debate on the nature of God, like what is God like? And Saleh, he's not exactly affirming everything that Ibn Sina, the Islamic philosopher, affirms, but he's a big fan of Ibn Sina, and so he's like, yeah, I'll just like kind of double down on this stuff for the purposes of the debate. I'm like, yeah, sounds good. I'll double down on whatever my view of God is. I don't have a good name for it, but I'll do that too for the debate. So that way you can get this nice contrast between these two radically different views on God. One saying that God's like simple and timeless, and the universe is co-eternal with God, and God like necessarily creates, and all this. And then me going, nah, come on, come on. Like let's do something else.
Well, in that context, it's an interesting context because his appeals, I assume, are going to be somewhat to the Quranic views as well. And you would say no because we in the text, but anybody who's coming from the Muslim tradition is going to say, well, yeah, but those texts are all corrupt, right? And
Right.
so it's going to be difficult to use the biblical text, I guess, in support of anything in that context.
So what I'm trying to do, and what we're both trying to do actually, is not make it so much a Christian versus Muslim debate, but really
Right.
trying, because you can easily find these different models of God that both of us are affirming across
Right.
the world's traditions. So a bunch of stuff that Saleh wants to say, I'm like, well, here's like a bunch of Hindu philosophers who affirm that. And then a bunch of stuff I want to say, I'm like, here's some Muslim philosophers that wanted to affirm that.
Right.
And some Muslim theologians, because the Muslim theologians, they love it when I reject divine simplicity. They're just like, Mullins is like, he's just like totally based right now. This is amazing. And I'm like, yeah, I know. Keep going. Um, and then when I say God's temporal, then some of the Muslim theologians are like, that's really cool. And then some of the others are like, I'm uncomfortable. And I'm like, that's fine. I'll just make you more uncomfortable. Let's keep going. So we're trying to keep it not specific to the different religions because we can appeal to different things, but I am going to be trying to appeal to different kinds of things. So for example, when it comes to creation, something you'll see in the Quran, something you'll see in Hebrew Bible, Christian New Testament, God creates the universe through wisdom. It's some sort of wise act. And so I'm like, well, if it's a wise act, it's got to be a choice, some intentional choice that God makes. God does it for a reason. What I want to argue is that the kind of doctrine of creation that Ibn Sina has and that Saleh is going to be defending, there is no choice there at all. It's completely necessary. It's not an intentional action. You could try to sneak something in there, and I'm like, not with the metaphysics you're wanting to use. So there's no choice there. So there's no sense in which you could really say it is a wise action. And I'm like, okay, there we go. So I can avoid a lot of stuff
That's
right
spicy.
there. Yeah. So we'll see how this
like
goes.
that. Yeah, no, this sounds fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the big academic project.
Which I love things like that too, because, you might hear somebody, in the church affirm Proverbs that says through, wisdom was there in the beginning, right? And it sounds like something nice to say. And you're saying, no, it actually makes the biblical tradition a unique and philosophical contribution to, like not everybody thinks this, right?
Right. Well, look at Aristotle. So Aristotle doesn't say God produces the universe. It's not in like, he's not, yeah. And God doesn't even know the universe exists.
Right, because he's only thinking about himself.
Yes, he's just thinking about himself. He's just thinking about the best stuff, which is himself. So do you exist? God doesn't care. He doesn't know. He doesn't know.
Right.
And so that is a really radically different view from what you see in the biblical text. And I want to say that's really significant. So significant that it actually forced the Abrahamic faiths, all three different traditions, to try to go, let's go towards this other kind of claim where God does intentionally create the universe. It brings about all sorts of problems for a lot of the other things they want to say about God, but they wanted to affirm it. And I'm like, you'll affirm that, but you want to affirm a bunch of other things in Scripture. Why? I don't know.
Yeah. And that's a radically unique claim too, just from the Hebrew Bible, because it's the oldest in the ancient Near East. I mean, no creation narrative has wisdom anywhere near the creation. It's usually battle, war, or drunken accident, right?
Right.
A god gets drunk and spills something. Okay, so that's the academic book, the discussion, the debate between these different conceptions of God. What's the other one?
So we've got this project. One of the fans of my show, he asked me to write something called "Letters from a Reluctant Theologian," and he wanted him.
Theologian being the name of your podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he's like you should write on a series of different topics and do it in the kind of style that you do for your show. So it's going to be charming. These are his words, by the way, not mine. So it'll be charming, it'll be vulnerable, it'll be sarcastic and witty and insightful, but yet concise and not like too heady and like not too like academic with the jargon and all that. And I was like, okay, let's try. And as I was sitting down to think about it, there's a bunch of different topics I wanted to do, and I thought, I can't do all these by myself. So let me ask a bunch of my friends to write a short little letter for it as well. And so I got a bunch of different friends from around the world and in different like departments and in their theology, philosophy, biblical studies. They're Jewish, they're Muslim, they're atheist, to write different things on it because I thought that kind of does exemplify what I believe in and what I in my show is trying to go. We are all on this journey towards understanding reality, and our different faith traditions are very peculiar. So it's the subtitle for the book is God, the Universe, and the Peculiarities of Faith. Because faith has things that are particular, but they're peculiar in the sense of like, it's kind of weird. And I need to think about it. Like, why am I doing these bizarre things that my faith tells me I need to do? So there's going to be some stuff on mental health and anxiety. There's going to be stuff on divine providence. There's going to be stuff on like why are we here. It's going to be kind of like a lot of different major doctrines, but concise and hopefully funny. I told people to be
Yeah.
as funny as they wanted to. There's one woman in
Dangerous
the
in written
exactly
form for
yeah.
scholars.
There's one woman in that I asked to contribute, and I was like, I'm worried you're going to be funnier than me, so I don't
You're
know.
like, don't worry, I will be.
Yeah, and that's what she said, and I was like, screw you. Whereas some others were like, I'm not very funny. Is that okay? And I'm like, that's fine. You're English. You can just sound charming. It's okay.
I still can visualize on the page, like in the third chapter of a book manuscript, where the editor finally wrote, like, enough with the jokes. Her not so subtle way of saying, you're not funny. Stop it. Um, just a last note. You did something in your podcast that I've never heard of before. I don't know if you invented it or not, or maybe it's something famous that I was just clueless on. Steel manning arguments. Did you invent that?
No, I did not invent
Okay,
this.
that's is that old school debate language or something? I don't know.
It's I think it's more recent. I don't know. I don't actually know the history of the term. One of my master's students at the University of Lucerne actually published a paper on this because he's really interested in like the proper criteria for how to do a debate and everything. So here, let me say what steel manning is, and then what I think about it, based partly on what my student said too, because he found a way to argue for what I already believed, which is
Perfect.
which is perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So steel manning is supposed to be where say you give a bad argument, and I'm like, Drew, that argument kind of sucked. Let me help you out here and like fix it up for you. Now I'll destroy it. So instead of straw manning your argument, I'm steel manning your argument. That's the idea.
So
Now,
fortifying the argument.
yes, exactly. I'm trying to make it better. I'm trying to improve it, and then still go, now let me argue against that. Alvin Plantinga does this a lot, where he's like, these are terrible arguments. Let me give you a better one, and then he'll argue against that. So like, this is supposed to be kind of getting the examples. And for some reason on YouTube and on TikTok over the last several years, this has become like, oh, you always need to be steel manning everybody's arguments. And I'm like, why? It's not my fault you don't know how to give a good argument. I've got enough stuff to deal with in my life. My job is not to give you a better argument, and so I just thought this was really bizarre because sometimes people are like, oh, well, you should try to steel man. I'm like, why? Like, I'm not being lazy here. I'm just asking, like, why should I do that? And so Ryan Shields, one of my master students, he's got this paper that is coming out soon, where he goes like, actually, in terms of like dialectic and debate, there's no obligation on your part to steel man somebody else's view. And I was like, good, okay, I'm glad. And what's happened is sometimes, so I was asked to do a debate on YouTube. And part of what we were supposed to do was we look at each other's arguments, and then there was a segment where we're supposed to steel man each other's arguments. And my debate partner, unfortunately, did not know the difference between summarizing and steel manning. And so he just kind of summarized my views, and I was like, that's an okay summary. You didn't steel man it. And then he didn't like the way I steel manned his views because his arguments I thought were really, really terrible. So I was like, let me just give you a better argument. Here's what you should have argued instead.
Right.
He wasn't happy with that, and I'm like, your arguments weren't salvageable. I don't know what to tell you, bro. Like, so, and it was one of those points where it came up like, well, but like, you've got this obligation to steel man. And I was like, do I?
Yeah, I can imagine in that context, you learn about how your opponent in the debate thinks by how they steel man the argument, so it can kind of have this informational effect more than an argumentative effect.
Yeah.
But it also, I think it's meant to give you kind of an empathetic view of from within their argument. So yeah, gaining empathy for somebody else's argument, always good. If you can, right? If you can put yourself in their shoes. I do, my time studying analytic philosophy was a struggle. It wasn't my favorite thing in the world. The one of several things that I really appreciated about it is there was an obligation in analytic philosophy for you to come up with the best objections to your own view and put them in your paper, right?
Yeah.
So it was kind of embarrassing if somebody came up with an objection that was so obvious but you didn't think of. Which I find myself constantly when I'm examining PhDs or, refereeing going, you really need to put your own set of what you think are the best objections to your view. So it's almost like what would be? I mean, you definitely people will straw man objections when they do this as well. But I don't know if there's a term for that. Do you know if there's a
I don't know if there's a
term for
term
that?
for this,
But
but
you feel this, right? This
I
pressure to
do.
do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel the pressure to do that. And then also some of the arguments, here's the phenomenon that's developed though. It's kind of annoying. Reviewers will go, well, why did you pick those arguments? And you're like, well, those are the ones that I think are really serious to my, that's why
Right.
yeah. And so that's annoying, but that's the review process.
Yeah. No,
But
I've definitely seen that before.
yeah.
Yeah.
But there's this other phenomena though that I've done a lot in my work where so here's an example. So Catherine Rogers, I love critiquing her because she's someone who argues well. She disagrees well. She has the exact opposite view of me on a lot of things, and she takes the punches. She throws the punches. She handles it really well. She had this worry that her classical theistic view somehow entailed panentheism, and at first I thought, no, it doesn't. I don't know what you're talking about. But it really bothered her. And so I sat down for a while to think about, well, does it entail panentheism? Is there a way to kind of develop that? And decided to focus on that objection in my first book because I knew it was something that really bothered her. And so I'm like, well, if I'm trying to critique her and hopefully persuade her of something, this is a move that she's worried about. She's really concerned with. I mean, I could come up with some completely unrelated objection. Maybe
Right.
she'll be cared, maybe she won't. But this one she is
Right.
concerned about. So in terms of like trying to have some kind of good connection with my debate partner, I
Right.
thought, okay, let's focus on that for a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So it can have some pro-social value.
Yeah.
But is not necessary at every turn. Well, R.T. Mullins, do people know your first name?
Yeah, I mean, because that's what's funny is when I see people writing, like I'll be asked to review something, and if they say Ryan instead of RT, then I'm like, oh gosh, this is probably someone I know. I don't, like, can I be objective now? Or I'm like, I don't know you. You can't call me.
Right.
Yeah,
You can't. Yeah. My
you can't.
my mother calls me Ryan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ryan Mullins or R.T. Mullins, thank you very much for your wisdom. And if people want to follow you, they can go over to Reluctant Theologian Podcast. And do you have a website as well?
Yeah, rtmullins.com.
That's what I've seen. I actually knew that as soon as I asked it, I realized I've been on that website. And you can listen to more snark and philosophy and theology for hours and hours and hours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.